Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. One of the big talking points of the Japanese Grand Prix weekend was whether Red Bull were actually affected by the technical Directive 018 introduced in Singapore, or whether they simply messed up their setup for the weekends. We got our answer with a dominant Verstappen victory at Suzuka, but that doesn't mean other teams weren't affected by the changes to flexi wings and potentially flexi floors as well. Word on the street is Aston Martin and Mercedes have potentially been affected by these changes, making it possibly even less likely that next season they will be able to challenge the Red Bull. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This is Carlos Sainz at the Ryder Cup All-Star game today. Believe he was, playing with Djokovic and Bale and some others. Saw him hit some pretty nice shots, to be fair, as well. There's also talk that Liam Lawson will be racing at the Qatar Grand Prix. This is pretty much a done deal, and to be fair, Ricciardo knows he's got a seat for next year anyway at AlphaTauri, or whatever it's going to be called next year, so he's going to take his time, make sure his recovery is perfectly ready to go. We think he might return for the Austin Grand Prix in Texas in a few weeks, but Qatar is next up, and Lawson will have possibly his final Formula 1 race for at least the foreseeable. Now, we believe that Lawson has agreed to be Red Bull's reserve again, as long as they contractually guarantee him a seat for 2025. To me, that seems like a pretty decent trade-off for Lawson. Yes, it's frustrating he's not getting a seat for next year, but they should be pretty well set. And we know that AlphaTauri are taking next year as much as they possibly can from the Red Bull. So their car probably will be quite good again. Better than you would think the Williams. He could go to Williams, possibly, if they want him, which is still a bit of an unknown, but Lawson would probably prefer just to make sure that he gets a seat in 2025. Where that is, we don't know. I wouldn't expect him to go straight into the Red Bull, although they could try it, depending on how well he does. Well, he's done well so far, maybe in Qatar he can have another good showing, given the recent upgrades that the AlphaTauri has brought to their car. And also Checo, we don't know what his future holds. It's certain, as far as I'm concerned, that he won't be in that car from 2025. Whether he retires sooner depends. Honestly, if he wins in Mexico, I think there's a chance he just decides to call it a day at the end of the season and retire from Formula 1, rather than taking, frankly, another season of humiliation from Max Verstappen. And as he says, after becoming a world champion, winning in Mexico is everything to him, and he probably knows now that he's not going to become a world champion realistically, given the way things have gone recently. One man that might is Lando Norris, but there are rumours that they are having contract talks. This is what McLaren do, and they're intelligent to do so, locking down a very good driver pairing for a long time to come. They extended Piastri's deal to at least 2026, isn't it? And Norris's deal is up at the end of 2025. So is he going to sign a new deal? I'm not sure. Yes, the McLaren made great progress. They honestly might be in position to be Red Bull's closest challenger next season, and they could potentially be a race-winning team and car in the near future again. Will they be in position to win a championship? I'm not so sure. And that one, as a customer team, it's always a massive challenge. And you would think that Mercedes and Ferrari will do a better job next season once they really lock in the Red Bull concept, you would think, compared to where they currently are. But nonetheless, they're having conversation with Lando Norris to try and lock him down. And they even tweeted this out, LN4, which is kind of what they did with Piastri the other day before they announced a new contract extension. So some are thinking that possibly this is, Norris is going to have a deal extended beyond 2025. I don't think that would be, for McLaren, sure. For Lando Norris, I don't know if that's a wise decision, because you never know what opportunity might be available at Red Bull or Mercedes, or really how the next few years are going to go. So we'll see. If McLaren get Lando to agree to sign an extension to like 2026, 2027, 2028, they've done a masterful job. But personally, I wouldn't expect him to, and if I was Lando, I would be waiting to get the call again from Red Bull and, potentially partner up with Max Verstappen over there. Yes, you're going into the lion's den, but realistically, if you don't back yourself to go into the best car on the grid and get a result, then I don't really think you're a racing driver of that caliber. Now, one man that was chewed up and spit out by the Red Bull season this year was Nick de Vries, and he's confirmed. I thought that he was going to go to Harvard or something, but I guess he saw his timetable and was like, no, I can't bother with this. So, well, I think that was only a few-day thing anyway. But he is going to be racing racing in Formula E again. After winning it with Mercedes a couple of years ago, he's joining Mahindra Racing as a new Formula E driver for the upcoming season. So pretty cool stuff. And well, yeah, that's the plan. A new look lineup, 2020 to 2021. Formula E World Champion will return to the series. There's also been talk that he is set to race with Toyota in the World Endurance Championship next year. So to kind of do both things at once and to seemingly quite quickly put his Formula One woes behind him after a difficult start of the season with AlphaTauri, to say the very least. Now, Red Bull were all the news during Singapore after having a terrible weekend, and the big question was, were they being affected by the new technical directive? We know that TD039 came into effect in Spa 2022. That affected the flexible floors that teams were supposedly using to gain performance advantages by allowing their cars to run lower and wear the floor more in areas where they weren't tested in terms of how much they can wear by the FIA. The belief was that teams, maybe Red Bull, were finding ways around this, and TD018, introduced in Singapore this year, was clamping down on all that stuff. In addition, though, to clamping down on flexible wings. So the belief was that Red Bull, it wasn't the wings, if there even were wings that were not abiding by the rules on the Red Bull. It was the question as to whether they were doing any trickery with the floor that was causing them issues in Singapore. Now, they go to Suzuka and they look basically back to normal. I mean, I think Verstappen's victory margin would have been crazy had it not been for Norris and McLaren having really good pace, and to be honest, showing that if there's any team that understands the new concept, the new Vache concept the Red Bull have created, right now it's McLaren on that type of circuit. Their car works the best. Maybe a similar story in Qatar as well, because the McLaren should be good there on paper as well, and we can see the progress McLaren have made through the season compared to Aston Martin, and also compared to Mercedes. Let's not forget, over the last 7-8 races, McLaren are the biggest point scorer outside of Red Bull, and Norris is the biggest point scorer outside of Verstappen, which is kind of remarkable. But Verstappen did his very best to make it clear in Suzuka that the technical directive didn't affect their car, and if it did, it's very minor, and realistically it's not going to affect, you would think, his performance and their performance from now till the remainder of the season. But did it still affect some teams? Because Ferrari looked pretty good. The TD comes into effect in Singapore. The belief was going into the weekend that Ferrari were not going to get affected at all, whereas other teams such as Red Bull, Aston Martin, Mercedes potentially would. The SF23 got that nice floor upgrade as well in Japan. They're looking better and better. The belief is that that's going to be their last major change. As Giuliano De Kessa says, that car is now no longer in the wind tunnel and hasn't been since August, or since July, really. Ever since August, it's been all about the 676, which is what is being codenamed next year's Ferrari at the moment. And even Ferrari, it seems, given some of the setup changes, the floor tweaks, stuff like this, their tyre deck doesn't seem to be as bad as it was. That was, again, Ferrari's key weakness at the start of this season, was that in race pace, they would burn through their tyres despite having good quality performance. But now the Ferrari's tyre deck was no worse or better than the Mercedes, and hasn't been that way for the last couple of races. Where the Mercedes might have lost out, though, is in terms of straight line speed performance with regard to the flexible wings. And this was the big talking point back a few weeks ago, before people realized that there was another element to this new technical directive, was whether teams were using the wings on the car, the front and rear wings, that would flex more under race conditions than they would under conditions when they get tested. Naturally, any piece of carbon fiber like this, it's going to flex. It's impossible to be perfectly rigid, and they're very strong, and they will go through a lot of forces during the Grand Prix. But in a Grand Prix situation with air flowing over them at 300 kilometers an hour, they're going to behave differently than they would under static load. And this is where teams can, let's say, manipulate the rules in a certain way, as teams will always do in Formula 1, to try and gain a performance advantage. Now, the expected effect you would have if the teams had to change out their wings in order to ensure that they didn't flex as much as they previously were doing would be a reduction in straight line speed. The idea is that the wing will be perfectly positioned under slow speed to ensure that it generates downforce in the corners, but at high speed in a straight line, the wing will flex in a certain way to reduce the drag and the downforce that it generates, and therefore increase straight line speed while maintaining good downforce generating performance in the corners. So if there were to be changes to the wing design mandated by this technical directive, the expected result would be a reduction in top end straight line speed for the teams affected. The wing would be the same in the corners, but at top speed on the straight, it would be still generating a bit more downforce than they wanted and that they were able to produce previously. So the analysis says, as Gianni Duquesa puts in this article over Formula Uno, that based on the data so far, we can't be sure on this yet. Singapore's a really weird circuit and Suzuka is only one track. But the worst cars on the straight among the top teams were the Aston and the Mercedes, implying that compared to where they were before, they might have been affected by this TD more than other teams. And as you guys can see here, just looking at Sainz's car, this is, well, kind of what the wing looks like coming out of the second spoon in the corners. And then when you get to top speed, when, so go 228 miles an hour here, going at 307 miles an hour, you guys can see how the wing is changing its shape somewhat. And this is natural. It's always going to happen. That's just how it works. The faster you go, the more downforce is generated, the more the wing is going to flex around a bit. But the FIA have been attempting to clamp down on how much this is allowed to happen, and it's not exactly clear what the rules should be on that, but that's what they've been trying to police because teams have been exploiting the boundaries, as they always do. The belief was that Ferrari, this level of flexibility is fine. Anything more than that potentially Mercedes and even Aston Martin were exploiting, that's not okay, and therefore changes needed to be made. So we look at the numbers here. This is in terms of DRS effectiveness, and again, the Mercedes DRS is terrible compared to the Red Bull. I mean, the Red Bull is 311. So if you look at the straight line speed performance from the teams with no DRS, pretty similar, 309, 309, 309. The McLaren, pretty good, 313, surprisingly enough. The Red Bull, 311. So that's no DRS. Now, the McLaren, I don't think is particularly efficient, but maybe they're running slightly lower wings than they usually would. The Red Bull, though, gains 24 kph with its DRS open. The Ferrari, 21. The Aston, 21. The McLaren, 17. And the Mercedes, 15. So in terms of straight line speed performance, with DRS open at the very least, they were significantly slower. Maybe part of that is just poor DRS effectiveness, which it is, but part of this big loss compared to, let's say, Ferrari and compared to especially Red Bull is potentially due to the new TD. Now, it probably is too early to say on this one, to be honest, but the technical directive certainly hasn't helped Aston or Mercedes. It might have helped Ferrari, but as was being pointed out here in some memes that were going around a couple of days ago, when the FIA bans flexi wings and now you're over a second behind, totally not happy about it potentially. So, look, we don't really know. It's going to take, I think Qatar will give us a better indication as to whether this has had any real impact, because we expected some impact from TD018 when that came in at Spa. We thought maybe it would affect Red Bull, maybe it would affect Ferrari. Didn't affect Red Bull, seemed to affect Ferrari that year. After that TD, they were kind of nowhere. And the belief was that maybe they had to bring a new floor and therefore it affected Ferrari's performance. Maybe this year we're going to see something similar for teams like Aston. I mean, Aston have been falling off anyway, but Mercedes were pretty good and now, well, especially at Suzuka, don't look so good and really looked no better compared to Red Bull than they were this time last year. So if this has pegged Mercedes back, you then have to wonder, well, this TD is still going to be in effect next year because that's what technical directives do. Clarify the rules. Those are the same rules that are going to be there next year. Mercedes might have struggled with this concept even more than we originally thought. And even Adrian Newey on the podcast that he was released today on the F1 channel, the Beyond the Grid podcast, said that the issue that teams like Mercedes have is that if you get the underlying architecture wrong, you're stuck with it for a season. As he says, I concentrated on the architecture and the front and rear suspension because they're the kind of key bits that you want to try and get right if you possibly can. If you get the bodywork wrong within reason, you can change that during a season. But if you get the underlying architecture wrong, at the very least, you're stuck with it for a whole year. And this is kind of where Mercedes presently find themselves and why they might be in a particularly tricky spot if they want any chance to actually catch Max and Red Bull going into 2024. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.